He was there, on the wet sidewalk, like every day. Worn coat, folded newspaper on his lap, and eyes fixed on the grey horizon. Frank Delaney looked like just another old man waiting for the rain to stop. But as the streets of the coastal city turned into rivers, no one noticed the old man with slow steps and deep eyes. Cars floated, sirens wailed in the distance, and a cry broke through the noise of the storm. "My baby!" Across the street, a car stuck in the current was stuck against a wall. Inside, a desperate young woman begged for help as the water rose. A baby cried in its car seat. And everyone just watched until Frank stood up. Slowly, firmly. He left his cane leaning against the seat, and then, without saying a word, he walked towards the flood. But what no one there knew was who he really was, and what that old man had hanging around his neck. The water was already knee-deep when Frank stepped onto the flooded asphalt. Each step seemed to weigh a ton on his body, scarred by battles that no one there could imagine. The waves created by the drifting cars crashed against his legs, but he kept going, without looking away, without hesitating. The crowd watched, confused. Some laughed nervously. Others recorded it with their cell phones, as if this were just another video for social media. No one offered a hand. No one even asked if he needed help. Frank didn't say a word. He just took off his coat, rolled it up carefully, and laid it on a concrete pillar. From his inside pocket, he pulled out a small antique pocket knife with a worn blade. His fingers trembled, not from fear, but from effort. At 86, every movement was a negotiation between pain and courage. And yet, he kept going. Because inside that car, strapped into a safety seat, was a life. And he knew exactly what it meant to hold on to a life too small to defend itself. Maybe you've never been through a situation like this. Or maybe you've already witnessed something similar and didn't know what to do. Whatever the case, if this story touched you in any way, if it made you feel, reflect, remember someone, write it here in the comments. I read everything. And your words make all the difference to those who come to this channel in search of something true. If you can, leave your like now. It's just a click, but it helps spread this message to many people who need to see that there are still real heroes out there. And if you feel that stories like this deserve to continue being told, subscribe to the channel. Here, we relive memories, honor legacies, and show that not all courage makes noise. The current was already pulling hard when Frank reached the car. But he didn't stop, not for a second, because what was about to happen? No one there was prepared to see it. Frank felt the weight of the water, as if he were carrying on his back all the years he had tried to forget. The pressure in his ears, the cold cutting into his old muscles, and that suffocating feeling that time was running out. Inside, the car was a silent trap. The baby, still strapped into the car seat, seemed inert. His face was pale, his mouth half open, his eyes closed as if he were sleeping. But it wasn't sleep. It was the limit between life and goodbye. Frank's fingers were shaking more than usual. He forced his hand through the shards of glass, cutting the thin skin on his forearm. A trickle of blood mixed with the dirty water and disappeared. Every movement was a war against time and against his own body. The knife slipped once, almost falling, but he held on tight. The cut in his belt was clean, clean. The old man still remembered how to act calmly in the midst of chaos. It didn't come from instinct. It came from muscle memory and from trauma. Trauma he'd never told anyone about, not even his wife before he buried her 5 winters ago. As he pulled the baby close to his chest, something inside him collapsed. The little heart was still beating, weakly. But it was beating. He wrapped the coat he was carrying in his arms around the child, secured it with a makeshift fold, and tried to turn over. But his right leg didn't respond. A strong spasm shot up his lower back, hitting his ribs. A kind of pain that only the most experienced bodies know. The kind that doesn't scream, but suffocates. He was sinking. And he knew it. He tried to swim, but a whirlpool formed by the flow of water between the cars was pulling him down. His left knee hit the bodywork. He lost track of space for a second. The baby almost slipped. And in that moment, when everything seemed to be lost, an old memory emerged with force. The first time he held a newborn baby in his arms, still too young to understand what it was like to be a father. And there, with death looming again, Frank understood that there was still time to do things differently. There was still a chance to make amends. With an impulse that came from who knows where, he stretched out his left hand and grabbed the car's door handle. He pulled his body up, spinning with what strength he had left. My shoulder felt dislocated. My vision was blurry. My breathing was shallow. But he didn't let go of the baby. I would never let go. When he emerged, the noise of the world returned with violence. Horns, sirens, screams. And the child's crying. Faint but audible. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard in his life. The people on the shore didn't know what to do. Some were filming. Others just watched, stunned. A firefighter ran toward the water, but stopped. The current was too strong. It was then that they saw Frank slowly emerging from between the cars, with the baby wrapped in his coat, held against his chest. With each step, he limped more. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, his lips parted. But there was something in his expression that no one could describe. A mixture of peace and pain. Of mission accomplished and a broken body. The mother ran. She screamed, "My son! My son!" When she got closer, she tried to take the baby from Frank's arms, but he hesitated. He looked at her tenderly and simply said, "He's okay. He's going to live." She handed the child over gently, as if she were handing over something sacred. And then, with tears streaming down her face, she hugged him. But the hug didn't last, because the trials soon came. "Who is that old man?" someone murmured. Where did he come from?" "Reckless! He could have died and taken the baby with him!" Frank heard everything, and he didn't say anything. He sat down on the curb with difficulty, his body shaking from the cold, his hands covered in blood mixed with water. He rested his elbows on his knees, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. He wasn't looking for recognition or medals. That gesture wasn't for the world to see. It was a personal redemption, a settling of accounts with the past. And even there, being misinterpreted by those who didn't know the truth hidden behind those tired eyes, he remained silent. The paramedics arrived, took the baby in their arms, and began the usual procedures. The child was crying loudly now. He was responding. Alive. Strong. The mother cried on her knees, thanking God, the heavens, any force she could name. But not him. Frank remained invisible. A reporter approached. "Sir, are you a firefighter? A retired military man? How did you know what to do?" Frank looked up wearily. There was no pride in his voice, only truth. "Only someone who has weathered worse storms." The young reporter was silent for a second. Then he walked away without answering. And that's when something no one expected began. Because one of the rescuers, when helping Frank take off his wet shirt to check his injuries, saw a small metal symbol hanging around his neck. Rusty, discreet, but unmistakable. It was the badge of a unit that few have the right to wear. A sign of honor and history, of wars that are not in the books, and of feats that have never been televised. The rescuer stepped back respectfully. He whispered something to the firefighter next to him, who immediately straightened up. Within seconds, there was silence around Frank. A silence that no longer came from contempt, but from reverence. People began to realize this old man was no ordinary lunatic. He was someone. Someone who, in the middle of an indifferent city, on an ordinary street, during a random flood, did what no one had the courage to do. Write in the comments, there are still heroes. Because sometimes we need to remember that. And there's still a lot you need to know about Frank Delaney. Frank emerged with a dull pop, as if the world had taken its breath with him. His face broke through the surface like that of a shipwrecked man who had been underwater too long, and the first thing he did was hold the baby tighter to his chest. The water still swirled around them, agitated, impatient, but the worst seemed to be over, at least on the outside. The old man breathed as if it were the first time in years. And in a way, it was. Because this wasn't just a fight against the flood. It was against everything he still carried inside. The failures, the names he'd forgotten to save, the promises he'd broken. The body, however, was no longer as forgiving as before. The pain in his right shoulder was already radiating to his neck, his knee was swelling underwater, and his arms were burning with scratches he hadn't even felt during the rescue. But the baby was alive. Cough. He cried weakly. And this gave the old man more strength than any training or command he had received decades before on the battlefield. As he approached the sidewalk, Frank saw that people's faces had changed. Some were crying silently. Others just stared with a mixture of guilt and reverence. No one dared to cross the stream to help him. He walked alone, dragging his feet, his steps stiff as if he were carrying not a baby, but all the memories of a lifetime. When he finally reached the cold cement of the sidewalk, he handed the child into his mother's arms, and then, as if a wire had been disconnected inside him, he sat down. He said nothing. He didn't seek applause or comfort. He just lowered his head and stood there, motionless, as if the silence around him finally matched what he had always experienced inside. It was at that moment that someone who was more attentive saw the blood running down the torn sleeve. Another noticed that he no longer had his shirt on. He had wrapped it around the baby, and a small boy approached with an umbrella in his hands. A simple gesture, but so powerful that it broke the mood of indifference that still hung in the air. The boy said nothing. He just opened the umbrella and stood there, next to Frank, protecting that old, exhausted body from the rain that was still falling lightly. The father ran to pull his son back, but stopped when he saw the look on the veteran's face. It was as if that brief, silent moment said more than any headline. The firefighter who was giving first aid to the baby looked at Frank's necklace and froze. The thin chain bore a small, ancient oval badge, barely visible beneath his wet shirt. But for those who knew, that spoke volumes. The symbol was from the former Forward Naval Operations Unit, the predecessor of today's Navy SEALs. Something that only a handful of men in the world could carry off with propriety. The news spread like wildfire among the rescuers, and suddenly, the same old man who just a few minutes ago was ignored, questioned, even judged, began to be treated with military respect. One of the firefighters knelt down beside him, checked his pulse, but didn't ask who he was. He simply said, "Thank you, sir." And he stood there, holding his hand firmly, as if they were part of the same silent code. But even with all this happening around him, Frank didn't react. He was distant. His eyes were fixed on the wet ground, as if he saw something that no one else could see. Maybe he was remembering the face of little Michael, the son he lost too soon. Maybe he was listening to the sounds of the jungle, the hot sand of the desert, or the helicopter that never came back to pick them up. Or maybe he was just tired. A reporter approached. He tried to ask a question. He was ignored. Another tried to take a picture. One of the firefighters put his hand in front of the camera. This was not the time for headlines. This was the time for respect. The baby's mother came back, now holding her son in her arms, and knelt before him. She said her name. She asked his. Frank just smiled with his eyes and replied, "Call him Frank. Just Frank." And that's when she saw it. The necklace, the badge, the bruised and wrinkled hands. The eyes of someone who has seen too much. And the truth fell upon her like a silent bolt of lightning. That man was not just a savior. He was a survivor. A symbol of something bigger, deeper. From a time when honor came in gestures, not shouts. Where the heroes did not announce themselves, they just acted. People around him began to come closer, slowly, as if breaking a bubble. A lady offered him a hot coffee. A young man took off his own jacket and tried to cover him. A police officer, previously indifferent, signaled to stop traffic and made room for the approaching ambulance. Frank refused to be taken away. He said he was fine, that he only needed a few minutes. But there was more to the story, because at that very moment, in another part of the city, a man was reading a notification on his cell phone. Frank's photo appeared in a video that was already starting to go viral. The man recognized the face immediately. He swallowed hard and ran to his car. Comment there. I see the hidden value. Because there are people out there who carry an entire world inside them, and almost no one notices. And there was something important that this man, who was on his way, needed to tell Frank. Frank remained there, motionless, with his shoulders slumped and his breathing shallow, sitting on the sidewalk as if the world around him had stopped, but only for him. The water still ran down the gutter, as if the city were washing its eyes, but no one knelt beside him. No one said his name. The baby had been saved. The mother was now rocking him in tears under the care of the paramedics. And Frank? Frank was just the wet, silent body that no one knew where to fit. A tired-looking old man with sunken eyes, hands marked by cuts and stories. He was the kind of figure that people look at, but don't see. Across the street, some people were whispering. A teenager pointed his cell phone at him, laughing. I recorded everything. That old man is crazy. Look what he did. Others wondered if he had escaped from some asylum. One man said loudly, they should arrest him. He could have killed the child. And those words, which hit hard, found no defense. Frank just lowered his gaze even further. It wasn't the first time he had been judged without understanding, nor would it be the last. And although his body ached in every joint, what really weighed heavily was the silence of the people who had benefited, and yet ignored him. What no one there knew, or even imagined, is that Frank didn't go into that water to be recognized. It wasn't about applause. It was about something that had been pending inside him for many years. A mistake. A memory. A mission that he couldn't accomplish, and that still woke him up in the middle of the night with his heart racing. In his mind, the baby in that car was the blurred face of so many others that he couldn't hold. And even if the world didn't understand, he knew. That dive was the forgiveness he never asked for. A lady tried to approach him with a blanket. He refused. Another offered to help him get up. He didn't want to. Frank just wanted to sit down, feel the cold floor, breathe, and forget for 5 minutes that the world was so cruel to those who grow old without losing their courage. That's when the wind lifted a corner of his shirt, and the small metallic shine appeared, hanging around his neck, a simple necklace with an oval medallion worn by time. Those who saw it only saw rust, but those who understood saw history. One of the firefighters who were backing up the rescue team looked up, frowned, and slowly approached. He crouched down next to Frank, as if recognizing an old friend without having to speak. His eyes fixed on the symbol. He knew what it was. He would recognize it anywhere. He reached out to touch it, but stopped in mid-air, respectful. Sir, excuse me. Are you really from the blue team? Frank looked up for the first time since he had sat down. He didn't respond with words. He just nodded. And that simple gesture was enough to change the mood around him. The firefighter stood up, serious, turned to his colleagues, and muttered something. Within seconds, 2 more approached. One of them was visibly moved. He took off his cap, rubbed his eyes, and straightened his posture. The crowd noticed the commotion. They began to grow quiet, not understanding. The cell phones continued filming, but now with less sarcasm. Someone commented, "What's going on?" Another replied, "I think he was something in the army." And then one of the rescuers whispered the phrase that crossed the square like a contained thunder. "That man over there is a living legend." It was only then that one of the officers, who had been distant and indifferent until then, approached. He asked Frank's full name. Frank answered. The officer looked at the radio strapped to his shoulder, made a quick call, and the response that came back over the transmitter was firm. Confirmed. Frank Delaney, SEAL Unit, active registration until 1973, Medal of Merit, Cross of Honor. Everyone stopped. It was as if they had suddenly seen what had been invisible before. Faces that had been distant began to lean in. Some stepped forward. Others backed away, embarrassed. And at that exact moment, the man who had been running through town, the one who had recognized Frank from a notification on his phone, turned the corner. He was a retired colonel, now a counselor at the Veterans Center. He stopped his car in the middle of the street, ran out, drove through the crowd, and stopped right in front of his old unit buddy. They stared at each other for a few seconds. The colonel took off his hat, bent down, and took Frank's hand in both of his. He didn't say, "Thank you." He didn't say, "You're a hero." He just said, "It took a while, but today, they saw it." Frank didn't answer, but his eyes filled with tears. For the first time since he'd left home that morning, he allowed emotion to escape the edges of his self-control. This wasn't about recognition. It was about quiet justice. About knowing that someone, somewhere, still remembered who he was. And everything he carried on his back. The rain stopped. The wind became light. And in that little stretch of street, covered by switched-off sirens and attentive eyes, an old man was once again seen not as a burden, but as a pillar. A living reminder that courage doesn't always come from loud voices or clean uniforms. Sometimes it comes from slow steps, wet coats, and forgotten medals on the chests of those who once saved the world in silence. Comment there. Courage doesn't age. Because there are stories that time does not erase. It only hides them. And this one is not over yet. The sound of the fireman's hurried footsteps cut through the confusion that still hung in the air. He stepped away from Frank, his face pale and his hands shaking, as if he had touched a forgotten piece of history. He whispered something in the ear of the lieutenant, who was directing the rescuers. The man listened attentively, frowned, and then stopped. The radio strapped to his shoulder made a crackling sound, but he ignored it. He slowly looked up and stared at the old man sitting on the curb. For a moment, all the noise of the scene, sirens, light rain, murmurs, recordings, seemed to disappear. Frank remained in the same place, his body hunched over in pain, his knees drawn up, his hands clasped together, as if he were holding a prayer he didn't dare say out loud. I was wet to the bone. And yet, there was something in his bearing that no storm could erase. Dignity. Even bleeding, even ignored, he exuded a strength that not even time had the courage to erase. The crowd, until then curious or suspicious, began to fall silent. The tension has changed. It was as if everyone had suddenly noticed that this man carried something that could not be seen in the eyes, but overflowed between the lines of his gestures. The lieutenant walked toward him without haste. He bent down. He didn't ask anything. He simply held out his hand firmly. Frank glanced hesitantly. Then he accepted the gesture. When he touched the officer's hand, his fingers were cold but firm. The two stared at each other. They didn't exchange a word. But in that silent touch, there was a hidden truth that no one around could fully understand. It was a greeting between men who know what it means to go through hell and come back with their hearts in pieces. It was the lieutenant who spoke first, not to Frank, but to his men. Attention. Everyone stopped. They straightened their posture. The paramedics who were caring for the baby stopped moving. The firefighters put down their tools. The police officers silently stepped away from their radios. And there, in the middle of an ordinary square, with the light still flashing and the water slowly draining onto the sidewalks, an entire row of uniformed men and women raised their right hands to their foreheads, a gesture of respect, of reverence. Frank didn't move. He didn't thank him. He didn't smile. But something inside him, and only he knew what it was, finally seemed to lift an old weight. In the crowd, a few people began to cry. They weren't sure why. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was admiration. Or just the pure, direct recognition that, for a moment, they had witnessed something rare. Someone who did the right thing. Even when everyone called him crazy. Even when no one asked him to. Even when no one thanked him. The young mother, still kneeling with her son in her arms, approached once more. Her eyes were red, her hands were shaking. Frank watched her, as if he were seeing a distant reflection from another life, and she said in a low voice, "I thought I was going to lose my son. And you appeared out of nowhere." He just replied, "I just didn't want you to feel what I felt." She didn't understand right away, but deep down, some part of her did. Because she didn't insist. She just rested her forehead against his for a second and whispered, "Thank you." The colonel who had arrived minutes earlier stood firm beside Frank. He gently touched the old man's shoulder and said something few had heard. "They have forgotten your name, but what you did today will make them never forget your courage." The sound of a helicopter began to approach. No one knew for sure who had called him. Maybe the firefighters themselves. Maybe the military base, which caught the movement. What matters is that, seconds later, a Black Hawk flew over the square. It was not a war operation. It wasn't an official mission. He was just a veteran, wounded, wet, tired, who had reminded the world what bravery is. Frank looked up at the sky. The propeller spun above him with a familiar sound. The same sound he had heard in the jungle, in the desert, at sea. The sound that always came when all seemed lost. The sound of the chance to return. But he didn't want to board. He got up slowly, with help. The crowd parted. Not like before, in distrust, but in respect. Like someone who makes room for a leader, a survivor, then a symbol. And as he walked slowly towards the old car where he had arrived that morning, a child followed him. It wasn't the baby, it was the boy with the umbrella. He looked at Frank like someone who sees a real hero. Not the one in the movies, not the one in the stories, but the guy who really feels pain and still keeps going. Frank looked at him, put his hand on his head and said, "You don't have to be strong all the time. You just have to be fair when it matters." And he went on his way. Comment there. Be fair when it matters. Because sometimes, that's what changes everything. And this journey still holds something that not even Frank expected to experience again. Frank stood there, still, enveloped by a calm that seemed to come from another time. The firefighters' boots still hit the ground in unison, echoing respect, but he could no longer hear everything. The sound came from far away, muffled as if he were underwater again. It wasn't confusion. It was memory. It was the echo of a past that never went away. Even with the crowd watching, even with the cameras turned off, the only thing he could really feel at that moment was the heart of little Michael beating in his memory, the one he couldn't save, the one who passed away with a high fever on a cold night while he was on the other side of the world, on a mission where he couldn't even cry. And now, looking at the baby in his mother's arms, he felt that some part of the universe had given him a chance, not to fix the past, that was impossible, but to turn pain into purpose. The child's face, now safe, now alive, brought more than relief. It was like a symbol of something he himself couldn't name. Maybe redemption, maybe emotional justice, maybe just peace. The lieutenant invited him to get into the ambulance to assess his injuries, but Frank refused. He said he was used to feeling pain, that there were things much worse than cuts and bruises. The colonel tried to insist. He offered him a ride, care, even shelter. But Frank just wanted to go home. And when he said that, a woman from the neighborhood, who no one had noticed until then, walked through the crowd and handed him a small laminated envelope. It was his bus ticket. She said she had seen him get off earlier, that she recognized his face. "You sat in the back seat and stared out the window at the rain, as if you already knew what was going to happen." He took the note carefully, as if he were holding a secret, and thanked her with an almost imperceptible nod. As he turned his back to leave, the crowd parted once more. But this time, no one looked away. On the contrary. They followed him with their eyes, as if they were watching the end of a chapter in a book they didn't want to end. A gentleman in the corner took off his cap. A child saluted in a confused manner. A teenager who had scoffed earlier lowered his head. That wasn't a parade. It was a spontaneous recognition. And real. Frank walked slowly to the bus stop. His legs were still shaking, but his chest was upright. He felt the weight of the world on his shoulders, but also the slight relief of having finally been seen. He sat down on the damp metal bench and looked up at the sky again, now clear, as if all that rain had washed away more than just the dirt from the streets. It had washed away, perhaps, judgment, forgetfulness, indifference. Beside him, the boy with the umbrella reappeared. He sat down in silence. The two of them sat there, an old man and a boy, without saying a word, until the boy took something out of his pocket, a small package of cookies. He offered it to him. Frank took one. He bit into it slowly, and smiled, finally. A small, crooked smile, but genuine. It was the first of the day. The bus was approaching in the distance when the siren sounded again. It wasn't an emergency. It was a patrol car, but the driver slowed down and pulled up alongside. The officer got out. He took something out of his pocket. It was an old military recognition coin, one Frank had received decades ago, but had lost during an evacuation. And now, here it was again in his hands. The officer explained that the colonel's grandson had found it in an old safe and asked for it to be returned. He thought it was only right that it go back to the person who deserved it. Frank held the coin between his fingers. He ran his thumb over it as if touching the memory of all those who had not returned. His friends, his brothers in arms, those who had fallen by the wayside. He closed his hand. He put it in his coat pocket. And he looked at the police officer with a firm gaze. What you do when no one is looking is who you really are. The policeman nodded silently. The bus stopped. The doors opened. Frank walked up the steps slowly. The driver didn't charge him. He just nodded respectfully. Frank settled into the last seat, leaned his head against the window, and took a deep breath. Outside, the boy waved with one hand. And inside, perhaps for the first time in a long time, he felt that the past no longer had to be an open wound. It was just part of the journey now. Comment: what do you do when no one is looking? Because in the end, that's what reveals who you really are. And Frank still had one last stop before ending this day that changed everything. Frank arrived at his usual bench just before 7 in the morning. The same cold concrete bench under the same leaning tree in the central square. The newspaper was tucked under his arm, and his coat, dry this time, lay over his shoulders like a silent reminder of the day before. He sat down with the care of someone who knows the limits of his own body, adjusted his cane beside him, and let out a long sigh. The kind of sigh that doesn't seek attention, just relief. The sky was clear. The rain was just a wet memory on the sidewalks. But the air carried a new weight, a different whisper on the corners of that neighborhood. It was the kind of atmosphere that changes after something important, when people wake up different without knowing how to explain why. Little by little, faces began to appear, one by one, without fanfare, no cue, only timid approaches. The florist on the corner left a daisy on the back of the bench and left without saying a word. The postman waved from afar with a longer smile than usual. A group of young people who had previously crossed the square with headphones on were now discreetly taking off their caps as they passed him. And on the post next to it, a newly screwed sign gleamed in the morning sun. Frank Delaney Square. In living memory of quiet courage. But Frank was the same. He wasn't vain. He didn't seem comfortable with tributes. He read the paper as he always did, his eyes moving slowly over the words, as if the outside world hadn't yet decided what to think of him. And he didn't care. But there was something different about his face. A lightness, a fuller breathing, a kind of invisible reconciliation with his own ghosts. It wasn't that the pain had gone away. It was still there, rooted in his shoulders, his knees, in the memories that visited him at night. But now it shared space with a new sensation: impact. Not the impact of fame, but the impact of finally realizing that what is done in silence can, indeed, change the landscape of the world. As he flipped through the local news section, he found his photo. It was strange, the frozen image of him with the baby in his arms. It wasn't a pretty picture. His face was contorted with exhaustion, his brow lined, his eyes empty. But there was truth in that photo. No pose, no filter. Just the raw portrait of someone who, even without the strength, chose to act. Next to the image, a report with details of the rescue, an excerpt from the mother's speech, and a quote from the lieutenant. "Some men carry medals. Some men carry the world. Frank is both." Frank folded the newspaper without reading the rest. He already knew by heart what had happened. What mattered now was what was yet to come. That was when he heard the sound of hurried footsteps approaching. He looked out of the corner of his eye and saw a young man. He was wearing simple clothes. He had a tense look in his eyes. He was holding a wooden box with something inside. He stopped in front of the bench, panting, and held out the object with both hands. "Mr. Delaney, this belonged to my grandfather. He passed away last month. He served with you in Operation Black Sand. He told me your story before he left. He said if I ever ran into you, I should give this to you." Frank frowned curiously. He picked up the box and opened it slowly. Inside was an old medal, rare, tarnished with age. But there was his name, engraved on the side. It was a medal he had never received, lost in the chaos of a hasty retreat at the end of a secret mission. He blinked a few times, as if it couldn't possibly be real. "Your grandfather was Carl?" The young man nodded, smiling with teary eyes. "He always said that you saved more than lives in that war. You saved souls." Then Frank closed the box carefully. He put his hands on his knees and struggled to his feet. He put the medal in his coat pocket and held out his hand. "Your grandfather was the most loyal man I ever knew. And believe me, I didn't think anyone remembered him anymore." The young man was silent, and then he said something that seemed to stop time. "We remember. Maybe in silence, maybe too late, but we remember." Frank nodded. He looked around the square, now full of life. Children playing, merchants smiling, and that small sign that said so much in so few words. He knew he didn't have much time left. His body warned him every day. But in that moment, he knew he had done enough. Not for the whole world, but for this neighborhood, for this child, for his mother, for the firefighters, for Carl, for the boy with the umbrella, for himself. And this was more than he dreamed of on the days when he just wanted to forget everything. Write in the comments, there are stories that no one can erase. Because sometimes, the greatest victory is being remembered as someone who was real. And Frank still had one last gesture to deliver. If you've made it this far, it's because this story spoke to you in some way. And if it touched your heart like it did mine when you told it, leave a like. It helps spread this kind of message and shows that there's still room for courage, memory, and humanity in the midst of the hustle and bustle of everyday life. Take advantage and subscribe to the channel to continue following stories like this, which are not in books, but live on the streets, in people, and in the silences that we almost never hear. And if you felt that this journey was worth it, comment below. That memory stayed with me. It's always good to know who was with me until the end. There's a video here that talks about this story in a special way. Click on it and stay with me there. You'll understand why.